So first, you've heard this sort of saying, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. I hear this sometimes from students. It's almost a cliche, and yet it's just not true. That's not what we see happening. So this is sort of leveled as an indictment against markets, that markets lead to a few elites, the 1% or what have you, that will rise to the top of the economic system, stepping on the bodies of everyone else who is made poorer by their activities. Now, part of this may originate from a kind of a fixed view of wealth, that there's only so much in the world, there's only so many resources, there's only so many goods and services that are produced, and so the basic question in many people's minds is, how do we distribute what's available? That is not how markets operate. It's not how economies operate. Economies operate by creating new things, innovation and creation, so that there is more. And the fundamental question really is one of production, innovation and production. And so you can see this if you look at society, human society, in almost every country over the last few decades, and every country over the last century or two, you can find an improvement in the standard of living across the board. Today, according to Matt Ridley in his book, The Rational Optimist, of Americans officially designated as poor, and by the way, it's important to recognize that an American who falls just below the poverty line would be considered rather wealthy in many countries in the world. So the American definition of poor and other definitions might be widely disparate. But of Americans officially designated as poor, 99% have electricity, running water, flush toilets, and a refrigerator. 95% have a television, 88% have a telephone, 71% a car, and 70% air conditioning. Cornelius Vanderbilt had none of these. And I think some of these statistics are a little dated. I was listening to a podcast on the way here, one of Russ Roberts' podcasts, and he was talking to someone who was discussing the homeless population. And the interviewee was saying, well, virtually everybody in San Francisco who's homeless has a cell phone. So this is the product of that innovation and production that the market system generates. One important question to think about is, are we discussing inequality here, or are we discussing the well-being of the poorest fraction of society? Hayek said, once the rise in the position of the lower classes gathers speed, catering to the rich ceases to be the main source of great gain and gives place to efforts directed towards the needs of the masses. Those forces which at first make inequality self-accentuating, thus later tend to diminish it. You can think of a society where inequality is substantial, but even the lower levels of that society, economically speaking, are doing very well compared to other countries. And then you can think of countries where maybe there's not so much inequality, but there's a very high degree of poverty. So do we want more poverty reduction or do we want more inequality reduction? Those two things are not necessarily the same. Now, we do see some forces that have moved us toward more inequality in some ways in developed countries. One of these is the superstar effect. We get more specialization, especially as we have an economy where people can trade with those in other parts of the world. So you get an international division of labor, and that increases the superstar effect. When people have a larger market that they can sell to, those individuals who are the best at what they do will tend to do very, very well. So that is something that's going to cause a little more inequality, as some people have an opportunity to do very well for themselves. Increased immigration can do this. Imagine someone from a very poor country who immigrates into a very wealthy country. Even without the well-being of any single individual changing, in fact, even if the immigrants' well-being increases after they immigrate, you can still see an increase in inequality in the destination country. So if someone comes from a country where their per capita income is $1,000 a year, and they migrate to the United States and their income, let's say, doubles to $2,000 a year, because you got that $2,000 a year individual in the United States, excuse me, that will tend to increase the inequality in the United States, even though no one is really worse off. So increased immigration can do this. Also, we have matching and mating kinds of issues that come up that tend to increase inequality of households. So today in the United States, high earners tend to marry other high earners with greater frequency than they once did. If you go back several decades, you would find more cases where a high-income earner married a low-income earner, and that would tend to average out household income much more so than you see today. So that would tend to increase inequality. Note that these are not really increasing poverty, and that's why it's important to make that distinction between inequality and poverty. There are some other factors that are worth mentioning here, and I'm only going to mention a couple to give you a flavor of the kind of thing we're talking about here. But we do see a reduction in inequality, largely because there is an elevation of the lowest income levels and lowest educational status. As that group tends to improve in their standard of living, you see a reduction in inequality there. IQ scores, as Matt Ridley has pointed out, the spreads have shrunk, not so much because the people with the highest IQs have lost points, but because those with the lowest IQs have gained points over time. British aristocrats were 6 inches taller than the average height in 1800. Today, they're less than 2 inches taller. Differences in nutrition and so forth have made an impact there. Early childhood development has made a powerful impact. Now, if we're concerned about inequality, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't be, there are some government policies that have actually increased our inequality, or at least worked against reductions in inequality. And one of these would be the wealth transfer kinds of programs that we see. Tanner and Hughes a few years ago pointed out that welfare can outpay work in the United States. In 35 states of this country, welfare pays more than a minimum wage job. And of course, you talk to someone who's more of a progressive on this, and they'll say, oh, well, the solution to that is to just raise the minimum wage. Well, no, that's a good way to render someone unemployed and on welfare, but not typically going to help matters. In 13 states, welfare pays the equivalent of more than $15 an hour. For many recipients, they say, especially long-term dependents, welfare pays more than the type of entry-level job that a typical welfare recipient can expect to find. Now, the problem is not, well, it is the absolute amount of wealth transferring that's going on, but part of it is the structure of these wealth transfer programs, which tends to create a kind of hurdle that someone in poverty would have to get over in order to gain income of a substantial amount from earnings. And a colleague of mine at Wofford College shared this with me a few years ago. This is rather complicated diagram, so I'll try to summarize this as well as I can, but let's look at the upper diagram here. This is the amount of income a person would have from their earnings and also from transfers. So you've got a basically 45-degree line here. Axes are not exactly equal in scale, but if they relied entirely and only on their earnings, then this dark blue line here would show how much income they have. If you factor in the wealth transfer programs that they qualify for at various levels of income, you find, and I'll just skip the light blue lines here, but the darker blue of these lines here shows what they have after they've been granted a benefit from a welfare program and after they pay any taxes they owe on their earnings. So what you see is that at low levels of income, their standard of living is going to be considerably higher than their earnings would allow. And at higher levels of income, after we get into the kind of the middle class area here, you'll find that their standard of living is going to be lower than their earnings alone would allow because they're going to be taxed on those earnings. So the slope of this is not as steep as it would be without taxes and wealth transfer programs. You'll notice that for certain ranges of income, like right in here, this is very, very flat. That is, if you increase your earnings, your standard of living is not going to go up very much. And that means that there's an implicit tax on your earnings beyond the income tax that you would pay on them. You're also losing benefits, which of course would be a feature of most any earnings-tested welfare program. If you earn more, then the government's going to say, well, you don't need as much in assistance, so we're going to cut back on the assistance as you earn more. So if I earn another $1, and because I earn another $1, I lose about 30 cents of benefits that I had qualified for, then my behavior is going to be influenced in a way that's very similar to me being taxed 30% of my income, okay? So if you factor in the actual taxes and then this sort of implicit tax that a welfare recipient would pay by losing various benefits, then the implicit tax, if you count both of those together, and they act very, very much the same as far as the behavior of the recipient, then you get an implicit tax that's almost 100% for certain income ranges. Notice that for lower incomes, the tax, that is the income tax plus the lost benefits, is in the 20 to 40% range for incomes below about $10,000 a year. Once you hit about $10,000 a year, you start to lose a lot of eligibility for various programs, and so the implicit tax jumps up to around 70% and then up to close to 100%. So this means that if you're a person who's earning about $18,000 a year, and you think, well, maybe if I work harder or get some more training and get a different job and earn more, maybe I'll be better off. Well, not really. You won't be. In fact, for wide ranges of income, the implicit tax is so high that the motivation a person would have to earn more, work harder, work more hours, work smarter, etc., is pretty low. So this means that if a person is in this low income level here, range here, and they want to be over here at sort of a middle class lifestyle, they're going to have to make a huge leap in order to get there. They're going to have to face very high implicit taxes. So this means there's a hurdle, as I said earlier, that induces people to remain at these very low incomes. Once you're past the hurdle, maybe you get some education, develop some skills and so forth, and you're over here, then your implicit tax is much lower. But in order to get there, you've got to do something pretty incredible to get past all these adverse incentives. So this increases inequality. You get people stuck down here, you get people in here, but you don't get very many people at the hurdle itself. Now, backing up and looking big picture on this, there's a study that's done every year, or every other year, I think it's every year, by the Fraser Institute, and it's called the Economic Freedom of the World report. And I use this in my macroeconomics classes to show the impact of markets on incomes and various measures to the extent that you can measure human well-being. You can measure things like life expectancy. Generally, it's better to live longer than live shorter. Literacy rates, access to clean water, and various other things. And so we understand that there are problems with aggregating numbers, but I still think these are illustrative of some of the issues here. If you look at the countries that they rank 158 countries in the last report they did in 2016, they rank countries by economic freedom levels, and they look at things like how much regulation is there, what are the tax rates, how much corruption is there, what's the legal system like, is it a country where the monetary system is stable, or do they have a lot of inflation, are people free to exchange money with other countries, lots and lots of variables. And so this is a kind of a meta index of various things that you might think about as relating to economic freedom. So you could think of this as a kind of a rough indication of how market-friendly a country is. And they divide the countries up into 4 quartiles. So you've got the most free, the next most free, the third quartile, and then the lowest or 4th quartile, where countries that are the least economically free would be located. What we see is that the countries that are the most economically free, that's the blue here, have the lowest levels of extreme and moderate poverty. 1.9% of the people in those countries, that's about 40 countries, have a state of extreme poverty, and about 2.3% are in moderate poverty. As you can see, if you're in one of the least economically free countries, then the rate of extreme poverty is 30.6%, and the moderate poverty rate is 48.1%. If you look at the income share, and this is looking at more of an inequality measurement, if you're looking at the income share of the poorest 10% in each of these countries, it really doesn't seem to make that much difference. There's a slight increase here for being in one of the most free countries. You get 2.75% of the total income if you're in the bottom 10%. If you're in the least free countries, you average about 2.45%, but really there's not much of a difference. However, 2.45% of a large number, large income, would be a lot more income in absolute terms. So if you look at the income earned by the poorest 10%, if you look at how well off this poorest 10% is, as well as we can measure such things, you find that it's tremendously better to be in a country which is more economically free.